Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Mastering MoSCoW Prioritisation with Andrew Craddock, Product Innovation Director at the DSDM Consortium. If you have any questions for Andrew, please fire them over via the questions box throughout, and Andrew will answer them at the end of his talk. We are recording the session, and the slides and the recording will be made available and sent to you tomorrow by email, along with our contact details. Now I'm going to pass you over to Andrew, and he will begin the talk.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this presentation on mastering MoSCoW prioritisation. My name is Andrew Craddock. I've been working with DSDM for since 1997, so not far off 20 years now. MoSCoW prioritisation is a technique that was created and contributed to the DSDM method right back in 1994. Since then, of course, it's found a life of its own and is used quite widely in the Agile space. So what I'm going to be focusing on today is looking at how that's used properly to make it sing and dance and for you to get the most out of the approach that you can. Just a little bit about me before we get into the presentation. I started life as a software developer in IT, working for British Airways. Started my career there in 1988, and moved through the ranks, if you like, to become a project manager in the mid-1990s, where I managed projects in a very traditional way. Using a very strong waterfall approach that was the default for British Airways back then. All my projects at the time ran over budget, over time, and never really satisfied the business person who was sponsoring those projects. That wasn't just me; that was pretty much a given across the board. However, coming to using DSDM in the 1990s, in 1997, ran my very first project using DSDM, and that project delivered on time, on budget, with a delighted customer. And I'll tell you perhaps a little bit more about that as I go through the presentation. Since then, I've been using Agile. And been helping other organisations to get the most out of Agile approaches. Okay, so moving on with the presentation then. So what I'm going to be going through is MoSCoW in detail. I'm going to spend I don't know, 45 minutes talking about that. So hopefully by the time we get to the end, you'll fully understand the MoSCoW prioritisation approach, respect it, and really quite importantly, also be able to sell it if you need to sell it to people within your organisation or the sponsors of your projects or whatever. Hopefully you'll have the ammunition to sell it in order to allow it to be used properly, and after that be able to reap the rewards. So I'm going to start off with just a little clip, only 30 seconds, from a sketch from Billy Connolly. So I've actually edited out some of the harsh language, but if you wanted to go look to see it in all its glory, you can Google Billy Connolly's "Women's Demands," and you should find the original clip on YouTube. So it was poking fun at the women's movement when it was first recorded, but probably even funnier when applied to business demands. So let's just play that clip right now.
We want this and that. We demand a share in that and most of that, some of this and all of that. Less of that and more of this and plenty of this. And another thing, we want it now. I want it yesterday. I want more tomorrow. And the demands will all be changed then. Be away.
Demands, and I'm sure all of you working in a project environment are familiar with that to some extent or another. I have had the misfortune to work with some clients where it almost is literally that. So one of the things that we need to explain is that you can't have it all. You can't have it now, and you can't keep changing your mind totally free of consequences. What Agile is about, and therefore what you can have, is the most valuable stuff in the time we have available. You can shape the solution on a day-to-day basis, and you can have the solution delivered to genuinely predictable timescales. So let's have a look at how MoSCoW helps us to do that. And we're going to start by looking at the sometimes called the iron triangles. These are the things that that people try to fix everything on. This idea that we can fix the features that we want, we can fix the time, we can fix the budget, and somehow miraculously we'll end up with a product that is wonderful and meets the business need in every way, shape and form. It doesn't work that way. In reality, most projects, the traditional style of project, will fix the features up front by defining a set of requirements that need to be met, and the project is then geared up to execute a plan to deliver all of those features. And sure, if there was ever such a thing as a plan going perfectly, then you would be able to deliver all of those features because you have estimated everything perfectly, nothing would go wrong, nothing would get in the way, and you'd be able to deliver all of the features. In the real world, however, estimates can be wrong, understanding can be out, changes will impact on the project, and ultimately what tends to happen is the project takes longer and costs more than was originally anticipated. And that's the as I explained right at the beginning, that was my real world in British Airways before I came to understand how to use DSDM. The DSDM approach turns that triangle on its head. To understand the fundamentals of what's needed, not all the detail, just fundamentally what we need, we should be able to estimate the work and fix the time and the budget, the cost of our project, also fix the quality, and if we deliver our solution incrementally, time box by time box, or let's use a more common term from Scrum, sprint by sprint, we should end up in a position of being able to judge every couple of weeks whether what we've built is at the right level of quality or not. The variable in this becomes the features, the scope of the features that get delivered. So the idea is that as things go wrong, as we end up realizing that our understanding of requirements was not quite right, or change happens, or we lose some resources and that impacts on productivity, or whatever the cause of the shift in our project expectations, or our capability rather, what we need to do is to shift the expectation. And what we'll do is we will identify the least valuable feature where we need to make up some time or reduce the amount of effort associated with completing everything, identify the least valuable feature and descope that. So we protect time and cost by descoping features if necessary. Now this is something that quite rightly makes business people nervous. Yeah, so they'll start getting concerned that, you know, IT people will go away and descope all these things and they'll end up with a solution that doesn't really meet their need. So one of the key things we have to do with this is to make sure that business people are in the driving seat of the scope of the features. We have roles in DSDM like the business visionary and the business ambassador who are responsible for driving the project at two different levels of detail. Business visionary at the strategic level, the business ambassador at the day-to-day detailed level, guiding the solution. Within Scrum, we have our product owner who fulfills both of those roles and provides guidance to the team. So first thing in terms of our understanding of why it is safe and appropriate to de-scope some of the features if necessary to maintain predictability around time and cost is to understand that the business need is not usually doesn't usually require everything to be delivered. In the pie chart you should be able to see on your screen comes from some work that was done by the Standish Group back in 2002. Now, some criticism has been levelled at this because it was actually a relatively small sample size, but for the survey they did of internal business systems, they found that 45% of the features delivered were never used. 16% were rarely used, 16% sometimes used, 13% often, and 7% always. So the idea here is that if we can de-scope things that, you know what, may never get used anyway, then nobody's going to feel that the solution is less valuable than it might have been. So what we exploit is the Pareto Principle, the 80-20 rule, which basically says 80% of the value will come from 20% of what we deliver. The origin of that statement was actually about wealth, and a guy called Pareto in 1906 identified that 80% of the wealth was held by 20% of the population. But that principle, that 80-20 rule, does seem to apply much more universally. So that's the first thing. We will seek to de-scope the least important features so as to maintain the real value that gets delivered in the solution as a whole. So we need to think business value, yeah, and overall value of the product that's being created or the solution that's being created for the business should override local interest. So what I mean by that is that often in projects we have lots of different stakeholders, all of whom think that their requirements, their needs are the most important needs that the project has. The reality is that's not true. The overall value to the business as a whole should be the dictating factor around the prioritization of requirements and determining what's most likely to be delivered as part of the feature set and what's perhaps going to be dropped in order to protect time, budget and predictability. So to do this, we prioritize early. Early prioritization helps us to shape budgets and plans for our project. We prioritize often to make sure that we're able to respond to changes in the project environment, in the business, in the market that our business operates in. Thirdly, we need to prioritize proactively. So we need, rather than wait until we've got a problem, we need to be constantly asking ourselves, are the things we're planning to do next, in the next time box or the next sprint, actually going to be the most valuable things to do in that time frame? And we need to encourage an atmosphere where nobody is afraid to challenge assumptions about priority and so on. I vividly remember a stand-up row I had with somebody who was called my customer inside British Airways, who was, in my opinion, being irrational about the demands that he was making, and he played the "I'm the customer, I'm right" card. And I actually had to make the point that, you know what, you're not really a customer, you're an internal person representing the business, but the business as a whole, British Airways as a whole, is as much my company as your company. We're both equal stakeholders in the company. The health and the vitality of the company is actually the responsibility of both of us in this regard. I actually ended up losing that argument, but the point was nonetheless valid. So that brings us to the fourth point: prioritize collaboratively. everybody has an opinion, and that opinion, through respect, should be aired and listened to. Ultimately, sure, business people who are sponsoring a project will have the ultimate say in what's needed. That's right and proper, but we don't want to be shy about helping to shape those decisions where we can. One of the things that I found very powerful in terms of deciding and facilitating the process by which requirements are prioritized is to consider a very simple feature by feature return on investment. Like I say, this isn't about sort of being detailed that we're going to end up with £3,247 worth of benefit associated with a particular feature. It's just a case of doing enough to allow the relative value of our features to be understood. Having done that, we've got a rough idea of value, we've got a rough idea of effort associated with building that feature or making that feature a reality. Then we've got this idea of a very lightweight return on investment concept in order to help us prioritize. So on to MoSCoW proper now. I'm going to start with some definitions, and these definitions are very important in order to make sure that MoSCoW works correctly, and very, very often get abused. And by very often, I probably mean 90-odd% of the time that I see MoSCoW used, I see these definitions used incorrectly. So let's have a look at what they are. So the first is the definition of a must-have requirement. Now, a must-have requirement should describe the minimum usable subset of the solution being created. And what's the minimum usable subset? It is literally the minimum that is required for this thing to actually hang together and operate. It has nothing to do with business value other than the fact that if it wasn't met, then nothing would work. Yeah? So our must-have requirement should always be described as a requirement that cannot be descoped without causing the project to fail outright. So it's not about the things we really, really want. It's about the things that if that single requirement wasn't met, the whole project would fail. That is the one and only definition of a must-have requirement. So sometimes it will be something technical. Sometimes it might be something legislative. So it might be a case of we wouldn't be able to use this product if it wasn't compliant with the governing legislation. Yeah? So either way, what you have, what you deliver couldn't be used, therefore the project would fail outright. The next layer down on the prioritization are the should-have requirements. Should-have requirements are requirements that there are workarounds for. Yeah, if there was no workaround possible, then it may well be a must-have requirement that would cause the project to fail. So there are workarounds, but those workarounds might be difficult or costly. And clearly, if we have too many requirements that are worked around, and that overall workaround or set of workarounds is too difficult or too costly, it may well cause the project to be a failure as well. But we're not talking about a single requirement causing the project to fail. We're talking about the failure to meet a number of requirements as being what might cause the project to fail in this instance. So we look to descope the should-have requirements as a last resort to keep the project on track, because we have could-have requirements, which are a lower priority of requirement that we can descope first. Could-have requirements are requirements for which the workarounds are easy or cheap, or in fact things that are just nice to have in the first place, things that might add some value, but if they weren't there, then we might miss out on a little bit of value, but it would be a fairly trivial impact on the project as a whole. So we can de-scope our could-haves without causing any significant problems. The final category is the won't-have category. The won't-haves are the things that are out of scope this time around. So what we're saying here is that those requirements may be out of scope for this particular time frame. We may, however, bring them back in another time frame. So I've done a lot of work with an insurance company over the last 10 years or so, and one of the things that they've understood is that a process within insurance where you provide a quote, you're able to sell a customer a policy, the customer is able to make changes to that policy during the lifetime of the policy year. They're able to make a claim and they're able to renew their policy are the 5 sort of fundamentals of selling an insurance product to a customer. In one particular project I was involved with, they fully realised that renewing a policy at the end of the policy year was a very important requirement, arguably never a must-have, because there was a workaround, and that would be you set up your policyholder as a brand new customer every time. So horrible workaround with all sorts of financial implications internally and all that sort of thing. So very, very, very high priority should have requirement. But they knew that they wouldn't need that functionality until 1 year after the very first policy was sold. So they were able to leave the renewal functionality till later, and in the first 3 increments of the project, the first 3 releases, there was no renewal functionality. It had been de-scoped. It was a won't have for each of those 3. And then on the 4th increment, as they were getting closer to the time when they needed to renew policies, it then became a must-have requirement for them to address. So it became a must-have in that increment on the basis that, you know what, if we can't get them to renew a policy, there is no point in doing anything else with this increment. So that was the basis that that prioritisation was done. So really important then to respect those definitions of must-have, should have, could have, and won't have this time around. The next thing to embrace and respect, and the second tip I would have, is to respect the effort guidelines associated with these must-haves, should-haves, and could-haves. So we start off here by considering what it is we're trying to achieve. So what we definitely need to achieve is the on-time, on-budget delivery of a solution that's going to meet the needs of the business. So that's our overall objective. It doesn't talk there about what requirements need to be met. We just need to meet that the overall needs of the business. And what we should do is we should prioritize and organize the work that is done to deliver the most important features first, ideally. So in terms of our must-haves, remember, we can't de-scope without causing the project to fail outright. Absolutely have to be delivered. Any one of those missing, we've wasted our time and effort in its entirety and delivered something of no value. So absolutely, we have to deliver the must-haves, and the way MoSCoW prioritization works, we set this up to guarantee delivery of the must-have requirements. No ifs, no buts, no excuses, guarantee delivery of the must-haves. Now, if you have a think about projects that you've been working on in maybe right now, maybe in the past, and have a think about the features that genuinely meet that must-have, the must-have definition that we talked about earlier, how much of the effort required to deliver that subset of features was needed, looking at the overall effort of the project as a whole. I would bet that it was less than 60% of the total effort. Now, occasionally, but it is only very occasionally, we end up with projects that have more than 60% of the efforts in must-haves. Usually, where it appears to be much higher, it's because people haven't actually obeyed the definition of a must-have. So have called things they really, really want must-haves when they're not. So, typically, less than 60% are must-haves anyway. So what we do here is we formally make it a rule that we shouldn't have any more than 60% of our efforts given over to must-have requirements. Okay, so if we have 60% of the effort in must-haves, that gives us 40% of the rest of the effort on the project to complete the should-haves and could-haves. We'll talk in a minute about how the guarantee works once I've talked about the shoulds and the coulds as well. It's also worth noting that you might have a project where there are no must-haves at all. If you've got a project where you're enhancing an existing system or capability within the organisation, and you may have, I don't know, a list of 30 ways you could add value or do more, but you might acknowledge that if we did nothing, we'd still be able to carry on in business, we'd still be able to do the things we're doing today. So arguably, nothing we're about to do is a must-have. All we need to do is to work out what the most valuable things are and to deliver those. Yeah? So having a 0% must-haves is fine. Yeah? So it's not the case, definitely not the case, that we have to aim for 60% effort in our must-have requirements. Definitely not. The could-have requirements, jumping to the bottom here, what we say is that it should be typically around 20% of the total effort in our requirements associated with the could-have requirements. So 20% of effort in the coulds, and that, the could-have requirements, effectively form the contingency for our project. These are the things, remember, that if we did descope them, wouldn't have a significant impact on the business. But if we did deliver them, they would have some value and therefore would be worth having. If we protect the must-haves and the should-haves with our contingency within the coulds, typically around 20% of our effort, then we're probably assured success. The rest then, in between the maximum of 60% effort in the must-haves and minimum of 20% effort in the could-haves, will be the should-haves. So now let's do a little bit of maths and think about what contingency is actually offered by this approach. Before I do that, I just want to talk about contingency in general. So contingency as a concept, if you like, the contingency is there to make sure that we have some flexibility within our plan to move around, to adapt to changes in the project environment, to changes in requirement, changes in the marketplace, change in general. In traditional project approaches, so going back to my days before DSDM, I used to go through a process of gathering estimates for the work and all of that good stuff, and then I used to request a percentage of extra time and extra effort to act as my contingency. So I would understand that maybe it would take 6 months to deliver something in this project. I'd ask for an extra 3 or 4 weeks of contingency just to protect the project overall against those uncertainties. Now, that sort of contingency, that traditional time and effort-based contingency, tends to be wasteful. And it's wasteful because of Parkinson's law. Parkinson's law says that work expands to fill the time available. I do quite a lot of training of project managers, and one of the things that I do to project managers who I have in a training room who are just getting to come to grips with agile ways of working, and in particular around this idea that we flex features to protect time and budget. I asked them, when was the last time you didn't use all of your contingency? So that's the question I asked them. When was the last time you didn't use all of your contingency? And it takes people a long time to answer that question. And usually they go fishing back in time to a project back in 2004, when on this particular occasion they didn't use their contingency, but every project before, every project since that they can remember did use all of its contingency, and very often more as well. So not only did the contingency get used up, but they then still went back and asked for more time, more budget to deliver the full scope of features. So work does expand to fill the time available. So quite often, therefore, it's refused. And again, been to organisations where they say, no, we want to see a plan with no contingency, and we kind of expect you not to deliver on time and on budget, but actually, why would I give you 20% contingency if I know you're going to use it and you're still going to come back and ask for more time and more budget? So if I allow you contingency, you'll only blow it, so you're not having any. That, you could argue, was in some ways very logical, but in others makes life very difficult. So traditional time-based contingency is difficult to control anyway. In theory, according to the textbooks on how you determine how much contingency you need, what you should do is you should break your work down to the task level. You assess every task level for risk, every task for risk, work out what contingency you want for each of those tasks, aggregate it up to the project level, and that will tell you how much contingency you need for your project. Yeah, right. So I've never done that. I tried once, and it was a nightmare. It just took days and days and days before I gave up. Usually what happens is people stick their finger in the air, have a rough idea of risk, and then add a rough percentage to their request to time and budget for contingency. The other thing is it should be monitored, controlled and reported at the task level. Again, yeah, right. So again, you break a project down to the task level. The likelihood of tasks taking precisely as long as they're planned is almost nil. So what we don't want to do is to be actually worrying about that. The most important thing is, once we've done all the work that's needed, have we delivered something that is of value? Going back to the refusal of contingency, sponsors, business people refusing a contingency budget has just left to the contingency going underground. Yeah. So what I mean by that is estimates get padded. Yeah, I know I'm not going to get any contingency, so I'm just going to add 20% to every estimate I have of effort, and that will give me the contingency I need. But it'll all be hidden. Yeah? And actually, if we hide the contingency in that way, it makes it impossible to control it. It's difficult to control at the best of time, impossible at other times. So, how then does contingency work when it's part of the scope of requirements? So scope-based contingency is what we're looking at here. So what we do is we use MoSCoW prioritization to identify where our contingency is, and I'm now going to talk you through the maths of that. So key things before we get to that, though, are the first bullet on the slide here, that scope-based contingency is integrated within MoSCoW and MoSCoW priorities. It's not something that gets added on. So what that means is we should estimate how long we think it's going to take our project to complete. We do this roughly and at a high level and we come up on that basis with our time and cost estimates. It should always be technically possible to do all the work within that time frame and that budget. I say technically possible, so we've estimated it and it fits. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. We know full well that the world will have an impact on our project and we're going to need some contingency. What this does, what the contingency within MoSCoW Prioritisation does, is it guarantees on-time delivery and predictability of outcome. So in terms of guaranteeing on-time delivery, what we need is sufficient contingency to allow us, without ifs, without buts, without excuses, to deliver a solution that works. So that should be defined by our minimum usable subset, the must-haves. And we already said that we shouldn't have any more than 60% of our effort given over to must-have requirements. So for simplicity, let's say we had a 100-day project, 100 days of effort in our project, and 60% of that effort was given over to must-have requirements. So 60%, 60 days out of our 100 days is must-have requirements. That leaves us with 40 days of contingency. If you do the maths, 40 is 2/3 of 60. Yeah? So what that means is we have 2/3 contingency, or 66% contingency, against the delivery of the must-haves. And that is the basis for our guarantee. If we can't deliver the minimum usable subset with 66% contingency, then something must have gone very, very badly wrong, catastrophically wrong. Yeah? So the must-haves, therefore, are guaranteed. We then allow ourselves 25% contingency within the could-have requirements. So again, going back to our 100-day project, we said that typically 20% of the effort should be given over to could-have requirements. So 20 days in could-haves, 20 days of coulds, 80 for the musts and the shoulds. We have a 25% contingency against delivery of not only a viable solution in terms of the must-haves, but also one that meets all of the real needs that the business has. So we've got 25% contingency against delivering the musts and the shoulds. So what we have then is a set of requirements balanced to ensure that there's no more than 60% of the effort in musts, and there should be about 20% in the coulds. And we go through our project, front-loading the most important requirements first, on a time-box by time-box basis, checking what we're delivering against what we predicted we would deliver. So this is where the predictability comes in. If we get done everything we expected to do in our first time box, then great. Yeah, that actually tells us that if every time box goes as well as the first time box, we will deliver absolutely everything, all the musts, all the shoulds, and all the coulds. If anything goes wrong in our first time box, or any challenge arises, or any change happens, then we'll deliver less than the expected amount, or the planned amount. And remember here with our time box, or our sprint, we're talking typically 2 to 4 weeks. So if we had a 2-week time box and we didn't quite get everything done, we'd look at it and say, okay, well, how much did we get done against what we expected then? If we got 80% of what we expected to get done, then we can predict, if things stay the same, if we carry on delivering 80% of what we expected, then we will deliver all the musts and the shoulds, and we won't deliver any coulds. Now, we never take this on the basis of a single sprint or a single time box. We'll see what happens in the next one. So we might go into a first time box. It's disastrous. We only get half done what we expected to do. Extrapolate that, we'd only get 50% done. We might not get all the musts delivered. Yeah? So if that was the case, you look at it and say, well, why was that? And if people look at it and say, well, I don't know, it just took longer than we thought, then there may be a a real problem with estimates or something like that. If it was a case of, well, half our team was off with the flu for the second week of our time box, then you look at it and say, okay, there is a really good reason why we didn't get done what we expected, and we don't expect to have half of our people off with the flu for every time box in the future. Yeah, so there's an element of that that was just a one-off. Yeah, so we don't need to be too worried. In our second time box, we can make the same assessment. Did we deliver everything we expected to deliver? If not, what was the proportion that we did? And if that turns out to be 80%, like the first time box, and then the third time box we make the assessment, it's 80% approximately, all of this give or take a few percent, then we understand that, that actually we should be on track to deliver just using the contingency that we have in our could have requirements. So the next slide is about how we deal with those challenges and the change and maybe lack of understanding of a requirement, therefore estimates being off and those sorts of things. So effectively, whatever the change is, whether it's a change to the business need, a change to requirements, a change to understanding of requirements, a change to our capability to deliver the solution that we're working on, wherever the change comes from, we need to accommodate it. And we accommodate it by introducing or understanding what the change is and dealing with it on that basis. So on the slide in front of you, you can see a beaker to the right-hand side of the slide. Our beaker is full to the brim with must-haves, should-haves, and could-haves. So that's the way we've planned our project. Remember, there's no additional contingency. Yeah, it should be possible to deliver everything in the time we have, but we need to be able to accommodate change. If you look to the little boxes in the middle of the screen identified as changes, one of those is dark blue. One of those is a must-have requirement. Yeah? So first of all, you say, well, how could you suddenly discover a must-have requirement, one that the project will fail outright for if we don't introduce this requirement wherever we are in our project? Well, one of the answers to that is we're all human. Yeah? Sometimes things don't get mentioned because they're obvious. If they don't get mentioned because they're obvious, they don't appear on a list of things we need to do. If they're not on a list of things we need to do, they're not included in our estimates, and so on. We might forget something. We might misunderstand something. There might be a change to legislation that has an impact. That means we need to do something new or something different. What we will do, using our model of the beaker, we would drop that requirement into our beaker. Yeah, it's a must-have, so it would go float down in the beaker to where all the rest of the must-haves are. And what that would do is raise the level of the liquid in our beaker. Yeah, so it push up the should-haves a little bit, it push up the could-haves a little bit, and what would happen, because the beaker is a fixed size and was completely full, is that something would need to flow out of the beaker. A could-have will become a won't-have, yeah, for this particular time frame. So that's exactly what we would do. Whatever the change is, time box by time box, sprint by sprint, we would actually say, okay, what has changed out there in the world? Is there any change we need to accommodate? A good tip for dealing with that, and again, classic example from my project days, the area I worked in was around crew scheduling. So this was about getting pilots into aeroplanes to fly passengers around the world. And the sponsor for the project came scampering out of a meeting that he'd had with the trade unions and said, right, we've just agreed this with the trade unions, we have to fulfill it, it has to be done straight away, otherwise the consequences of breaking union agreements and things might lead to strikes and all sorts of horrible things. So we sat down and said, okay, well, that's what agility is all about. We're there to accommodate that change. where does it fit then in terms of these other requirements? Yeah, so we need to make some space. Yeah, which of these requirements can we, these must-have requirements, could we make room for? Well, we can't make room for any in that. Well, that's only to be expected. They are must-haves after all. Okay, so how about these should-have requirements then? How important is this new requirement that you've brought to me compared to the should-have requirements that we already have in the stack? It's your call on this. You know, these are your requirements, your priorities. Where does it fit? And he looked at those and said, well, actually, looking at all the should-haves that are there, they're all more important than this requirement that I've just brought to you. Okay, so that will make it a could-have requirement then. Let's have a look at the could-haves. Oh yeah, it's definitely more important than those things. Okay, so what we've done then is we've added a new should-have requirement. It's not a must-have, which is what he first thought. He acknowledges now that it's not a must-have because there would be workarounds. It is, however, important enough to be a should, and that's where we slotted it into the stack. And we did deal with it in due course. It got delivered. Everybody was happy. So the message here around prioritization is that the business must be in the driving seat. Yeah, every time it should be business people who are making the priority call. Which of these requirements is more or less important than the others? If this new requirement needs to be met, or we suddenly find that it's going to take twice the effort to meet this requirement that we thought, yeah, which requirement is going to give way? Which requirement can we de-scope? In the early days, it's easy. Those requirements are could-haves. We don't really expect to deliver those anyway, certainly not all of them, and they don't have a great deal of value, and there are definitely easy workarounds. So it's an easy conversation. That conversation gets increasingly tough. Yeah? When you get into the should-have requirements where there's real value to some of these things, then it gets to be a tougher conversation. If you start those conversations with the trivia, people get used to the conversations and actually engage in that conversation to make good decisions about the things that are needed, and the things that could be left behind without too much pain. Top tip number 3 then is being able to sell MoSCoW prioritization to the sponsor. So these are the things that MoSCoW brings. It brings real predictability because, as I described earlier, we're understanding on a time box by time box basis what we're delivering, and on the basis of what we learn every few weeks, we're able to make a judgment of extrapolating from here. We can predict that 30 days worth of the least important requirements aren't going to be delivered, and the business people can decide which 30 days are least valuable and deal with it on that basis. As things get tougher, we end up in a position maybe where something significant might need to be de-scoped. If that's the case, then the good news is, and it's all about predictability, the good news is that the business have the time to plan around the likelihood of a significant feature not being delivered. They won't like it. Got to have a workaround. That workaround is difficult or costly. They won't be happy. But what would be even worse, make them even less happy, is for that to be dropped on them at the last minute. All right, we're ready to go live next week, but you're going to need to put these workarounds in place. So what we get is real predictability. Not the typical illusion of predictability that can come from more traditional approaches. So we have these plans where we've got a plan that says we're going to deliver all of this by this date. Quite often it takes till we're halfway through or 3/4 of the way through a project before we really identify that we're not going to get it all done. And we also have a real choice. Again, going back to my project management days before DSDM, I used to go to steering committee meetings, project boards, whatever you want to call them, and I would take along the account of where the project was. If things had happened, things had changed, needed more time and effort, I just used to request it at that point. And without fail, I would be granted additional time and additional effort to complete the project. The stupid thing is I was asking permission, and the permission was always granted. And the reason the permission was always granted is because it wasn't a choice. What I was effectively doing was going into one of these meetings and saying, look, I need more time and more budget to get this done. If you don't give me more time and more budget, it won't get done and you won't have anything. So what do you want to do? Yeah, I know we've spent £500,000 on this project already, but we can throw that away if you like. Yeah, or you can give me another 50,000 and we'll get it finished off. It's not a choice, it's a Hobson's choice. Yeah? Nobody is going to say, I'm going to write off £500,000 in order to not provide an extra 50,000. What we have here is nothing magical. What we have is a guarantee through MoSCoW Prioritisation to deliver a solution that will work on the day of delivery. And you know what? If there are more things that we'd like to add in, if we did want to extend our project, if we did want to invest more time and more effort and more budget in creating some of those features that got left out, we can do that. But it becomes a choice, a real choice. So this is the tip to the sponsor. You will get to choose what it is you would like to be delivered. The little quote on the bottom there was from the sponsor of my very first DSDM project, which delivered on time, on budget, with a delighted customer. And I asked him afterwards, look, Pete, you're really delighted, I'm really pleased you're delighted, but I don't understand why you're so happy, because we only delivered 70% of what you asked for. And his response was, it's the first time you lot, meaning IT, the first time you lot have ever delivered what I needed when you promised it. That's what predictability does. It's the predictability that provides the happiness and the satisfaction in the sponsor. So I then said, okay, but there are some things we didn't deliver that we should have requirements. Obviously there's some pain in the workaround. He said, yeah, you know what, I would like to spend more time and more budget, and I'd like you to do those. And I said, okay, so we'll spin up another increment of the project, another phase of the project to do that. And he said, yeah, that'd be great, but before you do that, I've got this thing over here I'd like your team to work on first, another project. So that project lasted another 3 months, completely different project. That delivered on time, on budget, with a delighted customer, and it delivered all the musts and all the shoulds. So we got better the second time round. And then I went back to him and said, okay, Pete, so do you want me to spin up phase 2 of the first project now? And he said, well, interestingly, that requirement there that I thought was going to be a real pain, nobody's even mentioned it. So I guess I was wrong in the priority or its value. Yeah, nobody's mentioned it, so I don't think we need that. This requirement here, I'm getting my ear bent on an almost weekly basis over this. Yeah, so we definitely need to fix that. This third requirement that didn't get done, I've actually got a meeting coming up with the trade unions. It might have an impact on that anyway as to whether we need it or not. So I'll put that one on hold. The other requirement turned out to be far more trivial than he thought, but he had heard a bit about it. In the end, we did a small enhancement and delivered that one requirement, and he was very happy. So time showed that the things he had chosen to de-scope as the least important should-haves, only one of them really was causing any pain. So to finish off and to summarise before we spend a few minutes on some questions, we want plenty of the things on the left of the screen in front of you, plenty of business focus, whole business focus, plenty of understanding, common sense, thought around the prioritisation, collaboration in the prioritisation, always realistic, always transparent in what we're doing, talking all the time and generating that predictability. That's what we need, and not the I want it all, I want it now, and it's all going to change, so stay awake. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the presentation. I'm happy to take some questions now. So hopefully some of those will be coming through very shortly. If you have any, please just type away, and they'll get flagged to me. Okay, well, I've got a first question here, and that question is related to prioritization as we approach a go live date. So how do you prioritize defects using MoSCoW? Okay, well, a very common technique, very common thing to do is to ask yourself the same criteria, same questions. If we didn't fix this defect, would we still be able to go live? The answer to that is, well, yes, we could still go live with that defect in place. Then it's not a must-have. If the answer is no, we absolutely couldn't go live with that without fixing that defect, then that tells us it's a must-have defect, a must-have fix. Should-haves are things that will be important but not essential. Could-haves will be the things that, you know what, they come into the realms of acceptable defect. It'd be nice to fix those at some point. Okay, so that's that question. Do we have any more? Yes, we do. Okay, so this is a question from Gareth. He's saying, must, shoulds, coulds, the percentages I gave you is on total effort, but I've seen a lot of people defining effort as a number of requirements. So if 10 requirements, then 6 requirements have to be musts, 2 shoulds, 2 coulds, or whatever. Well, there's no need to have a target ratio, as I said before, and you have to look at it in terms of effort. Yeah, there's you know, a requirement could be 100 days, or it could be almost for free in terms of effort. So absolutely, you have to use effort to try and do that. Yeah. So the effort doesn't have to be in days or hours or whatever. There's a great technique called planning poker and the use of story points, which allow you to come up with rough sizings. Yeah, that is absolutely fine. Based on those, you might have 200 story points in your set, and you know therefore that you shouldn't have any more than 120 story points worth of must-haves. So that was from Gareth. One from Peter. Now, does the resource load of complexity of a module affect its place as a should or could have? Right. Okay. The answer to that is no, not at the project level. So so if a requirement from a business perspective is going to be a must, a should, or a could, what will have an impact is the how strong a should have or could have it is. So we talked about the idea of having a little bit of a return on investment in terms of the value of stories compared to the effort. What you'd be looking to do there is to say, a story with a very high effort load and a relatively low business value, that should be quite low down on your stack, whereas the easy wins, the things with high business value and low effort, should be higher up on your stack of, for example, should-haves. Okay. Question from Nicole. Do you have to integrate this new delivery method into an existing corporate framework? Was it hard to sell? Well, actually, it can be. Yeah. So one of the time, quite often, you find that distrust has built up over a period of time because business people are just not getting what they expect in the time they get. Actually engaging them fully in conversations around requirements and priorities is the start point for that. So quite often that's a cultural change. Sometimes you have rules and regulations in the organisation that are geared to more traditional ways of working as well. So sometimes, yes, it does require shifts in corporate framework. How do you differentiate a should have from a could have? This is from Abhishek. The line between a should and a could is very blurred. Yeah. So what we're really doing is we're wanting to say, of our entire set of requirements, which are the least important that we could call could haves for the purposes of providing our contingency. There is no hard definition, no difference. It's all about a relative ease of work around relative pain of something not being delivered. I think this is Chanchal has asked, how do we apply MoSCoW prioritization to non-functional requirements? That's actually a bit trickier. Yeah. So, you know, if we have a requirement for our data to be safe and secure, for example, well, that's a must-have requirement. We can't have the data that we're holding about customers or whatever available to everybody to view or abuse. So what you'd have there is an overarching must-have requirement, and that's an example where it'd be very binary. Yeah, we must, or we don't worry. Others around things like performance, you might end up with some MoSCoW prioritization. So, for example, you might say we must have a response to this transaction in 10 seconds. We should get it within 3. We could get it in a second. That would be fantastic. Yeah, so you can actually prioritize on that basis. You're not using effort there, yeah, but you are able to quantify in terms of 10 seconds, 3 seconds, or a second. And what that does is it helps developers and teams to not fight for perfection. Yeah, so if they've created something, the response time appears to be about 5 seconds, then they might do a little bit more to get comfortably within 5 seconds, but they wouldn't necessarily feel obliged to go and do more. They'd be able to have a conversation. That conversation would be, look, this transaction isn't performing as well as you'd like. We can spend more time and effort and energy making it better, but that will require us to de-scope something else we were going to spend that time on. And again, give the business people the choice. Yeah, put them in the driving seat. How easy is it, Peter is asking, how easy is it to convince stakeholders in the first place about the priorities and how the loss of could-haves is a successful project? It can be difficult. Yeah, sometimes what you're having to do is you're going to have to ask for a bit of a leap of faith. You know, that's what you do to make this work. I had a case where there was a business person, one of my first clients after leaving British Airways actually, that I was helping. We failed to sell MoSCoW prioritization to the sponsor of that particular project. He refused to accept that various of these things were anything other than must-have. It was actually a life and pensions company, and my only experience with life and pensions was I'd recently bought a life insurance policy. That was my only experience of the business, and that was as a customer, and even I knew that the things he was saying were must-have weren't anywhere near must-haves. Yeah? So the project manager said to me afterwards, well, do we have to abandon the approach then? And I said, well, no, let's not do that, because the company has decided it wants to use, in this case, DSDM. MoSCoW's part of that. I said, you've been in this game for nearly 10 years. Why don't you prioritize the best you can? Yeah, don't tell anybody you're doing it, but do the scheduling on that basis, and continue on that and deliver what you can. We got right to the end of that project, and the last review before go live, they did a show and tell of what was ready and described what wasn't. And the sponsor came along to that and he said, oh, you know what, it's a real shame that you've delivered that feature and that feature rather than that feature over there, because if you delivered that feature over there, we could have gone live, but now we can't. And what I actually said as a coach, as an external, I said, gotcha. And he looked at me very indignantly and said, what do you mean, what do you mean? And I said, well, look, if you had told the team that that was a must-have requirement and these others were shoulds or coulds, they weren't essential to go live, where do you think the team would have been applying their efforts and energies in delivering things in this last time box? Silence, followed by an, oh, I see. Yeah, now I understand why MoSCoW is important. So he got it the painful way. Yeah. So, but what you really want to do is to try and get people on board with it. And the way you reassure them is say, look, it's you, business person. It's you that's going to be deciding what the least important feature is. Okay. Okay, and one last one. I think we're actually slightly over time, so I'll just answer this final question and then sign off. And this is from Chris. He's saying, if defect numbers have reached a point in the project that are deemed too high, is it advisable to stop the line to fix those defects over new features? What do you feel the role of the business analyst or business visionary is here? So yeah, I mean, ideally what you need to be doing is you need to be checking your quality time box by time box or sprint by sprint. But you then need to engage everybody in what's needed. There's no point in just pressing ahead, building new features and leaving a sort of wake of debris behind you of mess, of debt, technical debt, or whatever it might be. You would stop the line if necessary. And you would sit down and you'd discuss the consequences with your business visionary of, you know, ask the question, would you want this to go out ropey? Would you want this to go out, you know, with these things buggy? Yeah, and actually have that conversation. And a business analyst is a really can help with that, getting to the you know, presenting the options and the implications of some of those decisions. So yeah, stop the line if you have to, but try and get as much quality work going on within a sprint or a time box as possible, so you leave less debris behind. Okay, well I think that's about all I've got time for. So just one or two little things that I'd like to mention. The DSDM consortium have a member day where I, among other people, are going to be presenting on different topics to MoSCoW Prioritisation. That's in London on the 15th of September. If you go to the DSDM website, you can find details of that. There is a conference, the Agile Business Conference, that the DSDM consortium organises on the 5th and 6th of October. Also, information available from the DSDM website. And if you have any questions or any follow-ups for me personally, then if you email those to info@dsdm.org, then I'll try and they'll get forwarded to me and I'll try and get back to you. Okay, folks, thank you very much indeed for tuning in, and I hope to speak to you again sometime.